Welcome to my UdonSharp tutorial series. In this part, we're going to be going over a couple things. We're going to be going over namespaces, the differences between like public and private variables, variables themselves. Then we're going to set up a basic scene and then play around with that basic scene with if statements. If you don't have Unity already set up, I have a previous tutorial video that will be in the cards up in the top right and in the description below. That will go over setting up Unity, installing the VRChat SDK, and installing UdonSharp. Now let's get into UdonSharp itself. Let's make a new folder in here. It's called Assets. I spelled that wrong. There you go. And then let's make a new folder again for Udon. And let's create a UdonSharp script. Let's call it tutorial 1. Alright, so now that we have that made, we can open up the C# script, which is going to be the actual Udon script. And this U# file that it made is actually going to be how Udon interacts with our C# script. So let's go ahead and open that. And begin with this. So the first thing that we're going to do is namespaces. What a namespace basically is it defines like your work into its own category. So if somebody else makes like something similar to you and just happens to name things the same way you name things, there's no conflicts. So in order to make a namespace, you just type in namespace, and then whatever you want it to be. And then typically you would add a sub portion to, we can call this one tutorial. And that's just basically how you set up your namespace, and then we have to put everything in brackets. And that's it. Very easy, very simple. Allows your work to not conflict with other people's work in the long run, or even your own work. So we're going to start with public variables next, of actually getting into the scripting. Public and private variables. So when making variables, they either need to be like public, they need to be private, even classes and like methods, they need to be like public and private as well. All that basically means is public, other scripts can come in and interact with them, and private is nothing but this script itself can interact with it. Typically you would make everything private, and then you would only make specific things public that you want interacting with. In our case with the variables, if we get into that, we just make like a public game object that is a cube, or that's named cube. What this will basically do is allow us to define this variable inside of Unity. So if we go back to Unity real quick, and we can create a Udon object by adding a Udon behavior to anything. I use empty game objects. It's simple to keep things organized, and assign our script to it. And compile. You can see that we have a public variable named cube that we can then define game objects into. Now, if we make that private, and have it recompile, you can see that we no longer have any variables. We can do that with anything else. Just make a whole bunch of variables right now. Let's name these a little bit better. so we know what they actually are. Let's rename this one up here. You can name these whatever you want. Why is that being weird? Okay, that's strange. Oh, now it does an error. Okay, well, I don't know what that was going on about. Okay, so we have a couple simple variables here. We have a integer, we have a float, and we have a bool, and they're all public. So if we go into Unity, you can see that we have our game object still. We have our integer, we have our float, and we have our bool. Now, what these actually are is an integer is a whole number. So this can be any negative number that you want. You can make it negative 500. We can make it positive 500. We can make it like 1 million. It can be anything. A float is almost like an integer, only we can store decimals in it. So we can do 10.5. And then we can't actually do that in a integer. You can see it doesn't actually let us put the point in there. What a bool is, it's just a fancy way of saying true or false. It's either not checked or it's checked. So that would be false, that would be true. A couple other variables we can go over would be text and input field. These are two that I'm going to be using a lot throughout these tutorials. Now, what these two basically are is, if we go back into Unity, you can see that they're asking for specific things. They're not asking for game objects. So if we go into UI, we create a UI text. And if we create a UI input field, you don't have to worry about what these do at this very moment. I'm going to go over that in a little bit. We can define our text right there, and we can define our input field here. And we can assign values to these, and pull values from them, and so on and so forth. I'll go over that in a bit more detail when we actually get into if statements and setting up a scene, which we could start doing right now. So let's finish setting this scene up so we can actually use it in VR chat. Let's make a new empty object called scene stuff. Sure. We can put our main camera in there, our directional light in there. And then we can create another empty game object in there called Descriptor. And this will hold our scene descriptor. Now, what a scene descriptor is, it's basically going to define this as a world instead of an avatar. It's going to add the blueprint ID, which is just the ID of the world, and it'll allow us to just define a whole bunch of world stuff. So right now, there's no way to actually spawn into this world. We need to actually set a spawn point. So let's set our spawn size to 1. That will give us 1 spawn point. And then we can create a new object in here, just called, if I can spell today, called spawn point, and then we can define that as element 0. So this is where you're actually going to spawn now in the world. Now this is still an empty world, so let's actually give it like a floor. we can create a empty or a cube here. We can call this floor. And let's make this 10 by 0.1 by 10. And then we can lower this by like 0.05 and recenter it. Okay, there we go. We have a floor set up now. So you can actually spawn onto something now and not just continuously fall. Let's also just set up something to interact with, because this is just an empty world right now. It'll work right now. You can upload it, but you know, it's just a floor. Can't do anything with it. So let's create a cube just for us to do something with. And now we can start interacting with this cube in different ways with our Udon script. So let's now go back into that. I'm going to go over what like start and all this does in the next video. I'm not going to get too much into that. But for right now, let's just have it be interact. So if we do... this should be private, I think. Or should it be public? Public override interact. Yeah, it should be public. My bad. Okay, so what this is just going to basically do is when we interact with the script, it's going to do something. That's all you really need to know for right now. I'll go into what the rest of all this means in the next video in more depth. But for right now, just know that when you interact with the script, it's going to do everything inside of here. So let's set up some variables to use. We want a game object. Let's call that cube. And this will hold our cube. And then we can also make a Boolean. Let's make it a private. We can call that like cube active. And let's make all of this private so we just don't see it in the editor. I'll keep it in here just for reference, but just note that we're not going to be using any of this. I'm going to have this script available to download on my GitHub at the in the links in the description as well. I'll leave all this in so there is reference to all the past stuff that I've done, which is why I'm not deleting it. Normally I would delete all this just to keep it a bit more efficient and everything, but for the sake of learning, let's keep it in. So we now have a public game object named cube, and we have a public Boolean called cube active, or a private Boolean called cube active. I'm sorry. Now if we go back to Unity and go back to our... I should name this. Just name it Udon script. And we compile, which it's already compiled. You can see that we only have one public variable called cube, which I would like to make this. We can click on it, confirm. It is pointing to our single cube. Now we can start doing stuff with this cube now. So let's first check to see if it's active. So we can do cube active equals cube dot activeSelf. So now this is going to take our variable cube active, which is a true or false. It's going to take cube and then check to see if it's active. And if it is, it's going to return true, and then set this to true. And if it's not active, it's going to return false, and then set this to false. Now, what we're checking exactly with activeSelf is we're checking to see if this check mark right here is clicked. So right now, if we run this right now, this will return true, and that will return false. However, let's say this is parented to something, and we turn the parent off. This will still return true, and this will still return false. We're not checking to see if the object is physically active. We're just checking to see if the object is active on its own. If we want to check if the object is active at all, we can do activeInHierarchy. So this is going to check if the cube is active at all. So right now, even though this is checkmarked, it'll return false. And that will return true because the cube is actually active. And that will return false. And that will return false as well, even though that's still marked as active. That's the only difference between activeInHierarchy and activeSelf. We're going to be using activeSelf. So now that we have the state of the cube, we can check that and turn the cube on or off depending on what state the cube is in. So if we make an if statement, we can check if cube active is equal to true. So what this is basically going to do is it's going to take our variable cube active, and if it's true, it's going to do everything in here. If it's false, it's going to skip everything in here. So if our cube is active, we can take our cube, we can set active, and we can make that false. So now what this is going to do is it's going to take our cube, our game object cube, it's going to set its active to false. So we're just going to go over here and we're going to uncheck that. That's basically all we're doing. So if we run right now with the play button up here, and go to our Udon script when this is done compiling, and we interact with it, all right, so we forgot to save. little mistakes here and there. So as you can see, we hit play mode. We interact with our Udon script, and our cube turns off. But we currently have no way to actually turn that cube back on. So let's fix that. Let's make a new if statement. Cube active is equal to false. We can take our cube again and set its active to true. Let's actually save this time. A little bit of smooth brain hours. Make sure that's compiled. And let's run. So if we interact with our Udon script, it should turn off, and then it turns back on. Now, we can't actually do this in-game. We're just interacting with the script on its in the editor. We have no way of actually interacting with this in-game. So let's set that up. Let's make a UI button. Now, this button should be huge, because our canvas starts out huge. So what the button basically does, if you make a button without a canvas, it makes its own canvas. That's how we have a canvas here. So let's take our canvas and set it to world space, not screen space, so we can actually interact with it with the world. Give it like a position and everything. Let's make its height 1000, its width 1000, and then we mess with the scale right here. Let's make that 0.01, and then set our position to 0, 0. Now if we go over to our canvas, it's still a little bit too big. Let's shrink it one more time. And that's a good size right there. One small thing that I'm going to just inject right here that I forgot to go over when recording the video is the Z-scale on the canvas should be set to really tiny. Because when you get into VR chat and try using the canvas, it's going to actually have like 1 meter of like depth to it. And you don't really want that when you're interacting with the menu. So just make sure your Z scale is set from 1 to point like 0.00001 or something. That's everything. Back to the video. Now our button's really tiny, so let's make that a bit bigger. Let's make that 1000 and 500. Make our position 0, 0, and then I do believe our canvas is backwards. It is. And now we can't read the text on this button, so if we go to our text, we set the font size to, let's say, 150, and then we can name this Toggle Cube. So we have our basic button set up. But if we use this button now, nothing's going to happen. It's not pointing towards anything. We can't actually interact with it in VR chat at all at the moment. In order to do that, we need to go to our canvas, and we need to add a component, and it will be a UI shape. What this is going to basically do is allow us to interact with this canvas, anything on this canvas, whether it be a button, an input field, anything. Allow us to interact with that inside of VR chat. One more thing that I should add in is you should go to your canvas and go up to the top in your inspector where it says layer and change that layer from UI to default. What this is going to do is it's going to allow you to interact with your canvas just freely. If you keep it on the UI layer, you're going to have to open up your menu in order to interact with the canvas. So let's go back to our button and we go down here to on click. So when we click on this button, it's currently doing nothing. So let's add something to here. Point it towards our Udon script. Go to no function, go to Udon behavior, and then hit interact. So now what this is going to do is when we click on this button, it's going to interact with our Udon script, which is going to be the same thing as us hitting this interact button. So now that this button's actually set up to work in VR chat and set up to just work in general, we can hit play again. Go into our game mode, which it should automatically swap. It does. But our camera is in a really bad spot. So our camera's up here in scene stuff. Let's rotate it so it'll be facing our cube and our button and move it back here and then go back into the game. So when we click on this cube, our cube turns, or when we click on this button, our cube turns off. We click on this button again, our cube turns on. And that works. And there's one last thing we need to do with this button. And that is right over here where it says navigation. Now, what navigation is, you know, in most games and when you go to the main menu, you can navigate the menu with the arrow keys, typically, or WASD, all that. And it allows you to navigate between buttons and just different fields and all that. That's all great for when you're working with normal, like, games on desktop or console, but in VR, it's bad. Have you seen those worlds where it has sliders? And then you interact with that slider, then you start moving around, and that slider continues to move as you move? That's because navigation isn't off. So let's turn this navigation from automatic to none. So now when you're interacting with this button, you're not going to be jumping to other buttons, you're not going to be moving sliders around, you're not going to be interacting with input fields. It's just going to do what that button does, and then not going to hold on to it and try to jump to something else when you start moving around. And this is all set up now. If you upload this world, you go in here and you click this button, this cube's going to turn off, and this cube's going to turn on. So we're more or less done right now. But we can optimize our script a little bit. Right now we have 2 if statements, and we're checking for a variable. We can actually cut this down a lot. There's a lot in here, and there's a lot we can actually cut out. We can get rid of like this second if statement altogether. If we just make this if and else, that's just cut out a whole nother if statement. So what our script is going to do now is it's going to check if the cube is active. And then if it's not active, it's going to do everything in here. So if cube active is true, it's going to do this. If cube active is false, it's going to be doing this. We don't have to have 2 if statements there. We can just cut that down to 1 and just use that else. So if we go back into Unity and hit play, our button is going to act just like it did before. There's going to be no changes with it at all. Let's go to our Udon script and interact with it. It's going to turn off, then it's going to turn on. Now that already made our script a little bit more efficient, but we can get even more efficient with it. We can get rid of this Boolean altogether. So instead of checking to see if it's active here, let's just have the cube turn itself off. So if we go up to here, we can do cube set active, and then we can check to see if the cube is active. Cube activeSelf. And then we can do the opposite of that. So what this is now doing is we're taking our cube, we're setting its active, and we're setting its active to the opposite of whatever it currently is. So we can now get rid of all of this. So I can just comment this out. And I can comment this out as well. So what this is doing, it's just telling our compiler to ignore these. We only have this line now. In fact, I can just delete these altogether. That's probably what I would do in this case, but for the sake of just having everything here as reference, I'm going to leave it in. So let's save, go back to Unity. Let's make sure it's compiled. And we can interact with our script. And you can see it does exactly what it did before, but instead of using like, how many lines was that? Like 10 lines? We compressed that down into only 1 line. And that's going to be everything I go over in this tutorial. don't forget to check out the next tutorial of where I'm actually going to be going over methods. I'm going to be diving more into what all of this means, and I'm going to be taking a look at how to make custom methods and go more into that. All right, have a wonderful day, and hope you make some interesting stuff. Thank you for watching this tutorial. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also check out our website and Patreon to support more content like this being produced. The links for those will be in the description, along with everything else I've gone over in the video.